me a second because Zoom might require me to. I don't know what immersive is. Nope, that's not what I want. Are you sharing anything?
I am.
There it
Now I
is.
can see my screen. You good?
I think so.
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, welcome everybody to Embracing the Power of Blocks. So it's awesome that Beth gave her talk because our talks could not be more different. She has such a deep knowledge of project management, running an agency, that entire side of WordPress. This talk is not that, but hopefully it provides some good contrast. So a little bit about me. So I'm calling myself a WordPress developer, but I've actually been doing hospitality marketing for the last 9 years. So I've been working in hospitality my entire life. I have no formal training in web development or really any other coding environment for that matter. But as part of working in marketing for the resort I worked with, they needed to build a blog for the culinary staff, and we discovered WordPress in 2012. And after discovering WordPress, I kind of just fell in love with it. You know, you crack open a theme, kind of play around with things. And over time, over the next 2 years of just playing around with WordPress as a hobby, I released my first WordPress plugin in 2014. And then in 2020, in April, we all know what happened, the pandemic hit. And the resort I worked for actually closed for a short period of time. I stayed on, but we were basically shut. And so that gave me time to kind of go back and continue exploring WordPress. And I spent a lot of time looking at the new block editor, or Gutenberg, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. And at that time, after building lots of plugins in PHP and all these coding languages, I realized, I really need to learn JavaScript and React to start working with the block editor in Gutenberg. So the pandemic gave me the time to do that. And so during the summer, I quote unquote learned JavaScript and React. And we'll talk more about this if you're not familiar with those two coding languages. We'll talk more about this as the talk continues. But it gave me time to learn these new coding languages, enough to start understanding how the new block editor and Gutenberg worked. And then I was able to release my first kind of block-based plugin as kind of a side experiment, just to kind of experiment with the stuff that I had learned. And then in June 2021, I retired from the hospitality business. And I decided that now is the time to start doing WordPress development full time. So why do I tell you all this? I tell you all this to say that everything that I'm about to talk about, I have learned myself. And there could be some things that are incorrect, but also kind of showcase how I went through this process. You know, I'm not working for a big company that's building massive sites for clients. This was kind of my journey through WordPress in this new modern environment, which, you know, everybody was new at one point. And so way back in 2012, when I was first learning WordPress in PHP, so much has changed now. And I think that this will be kind of a good overview of those changes. So let's start by the very simple question of what is a block? Well, from the WordPress.org support page, blocks are components for adding content to the new WordPress block editor. But let's focus on components for adding content, because I think that that's like the simplest way to think about it. It's just a tool for adding content. So as we start talking about blocks, it behooves us to start talking about the history of Gutenberg. So, and I always like to start in 2015. So I'm not sure how many on this call watched the State of the Word address by Matt back in 2015. But at the very end of it, he said something very important, which was learn JavaScript deeply. And this was kind of at the time when Calypso had just come out. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that, which was built on Node and React was kind of new at that time. And it was kind of ominous, right? And I didn't start learning JavaScript until 2020. So clearly I didn't really learn from his premonition there. But sure enough, in 2017, they started development on the Gutenberg plugin. We're not going to talk about why it has a 2-star rating, but suffice it to say, there is some controversy around the project. It's a big change. Any big change has controversy. So the before times. So a lot of us in this room are probably still using a lot of this. We have the classic WordPress editor. We have navigation menus on their own, own screen, and we have widgets. All this stuff is core quintessential WordPress. But in 2 years or 3 years or however long, or even today, like personally, I don't use any of this. And it's just a testament to how far WordPress has come and how quickly things are changing. So another quote here, this one by Matt. So what is the idea of a block? The idea of a block was to create a new common language across WordPress. So, and to replace a number of old content types like shortcodes and widgets. So if we go back here and we look at this page, we have the post editor or the classic editor. We have widgets, which are kind of like their own content type. Then we have navigation menus and navigation links and stuff. These are kind of all three separate entities. And so blocks were kind of a way to kind of encapsulate everything into one common language. So with that vision in mind, in 2018, WordPress 5.0 is released. And with that release came the block editor. So those who have used the block editor, this is what it looks like. And you remember in that quote by Matt, he was talking about taking widgets and other things like it and putting into this common language of blocks. And here you can see latest posts, which was a widget, is still a widget, is now brought into the block editor as a block itself. So we're starting to see all these different content types within WordPress being consolidated into one place. So then fast forward a lot during 2018 and July 2021, tons of stuff happened. Lots of development on Gutenberg, lots of setbacks. You go back and look at the articles and video clips of the projections and how fast we were going to move with the block editor. Every benchmark or every timetable has been blown out of the water. But in July 2021, WordPress 5.8 was released, which provided preliminary support for theme.json, block-based widgets, and it sets the stage for full site editing. So I'm not going to go into all of this, but 5.8 was a very big release, and 5.9, which will hopefully be coming or potentially be coming at the end of this year or beginning of 2022, will be a huge release because it will incorporate full site editing. Okay, so what is full site editing? I doubt many people are actually using full site editing at this time. It is really like the bleeding edge of WordPress. And in order to use full site editing functionality, you need to have the Gutenberg plugin installed. So the past couple screenshots, we were looking at kind of this homepage for an outdoor adventure company. Full site editing takes all the functionality of WordPress, all the standard functionality of WordPress, like headers and templates and the page itself, and it brings it into one editing interface. So you can see on this is what's called the site editor. We have our navigation, we have templates, and the key piece here is that everything is a block. Even the template parts, even parts of the template, they're all blocks. So we've transitioned from old WordPress, where you had these different content types, to now in the future where everything is a block. And the question is, okay, cool, but why does that matter? Why is that a good thing to pursue? And because it's a hard road. I mean, WordPress has been, what is it, 42% of the internet? So many people have built so many powerful things on top of WordPress. You start to introduce this new concept of blocks and the site editor, the block editor, it tends to severely disrupt businesses, like what Beth was talking about, agencies running businesses with clients and stuff who've been doing the same thing year after year with the quote unquote classic editor and widgets and all that stuff. People, I myself have built plugins specifically for widgets, plugins specifically for navigation. And now we're talking about this dynamic when everything is one content type. So it breeds a lot of controversy and it is challenging for the community to adapt to it. So this quote, I like, but also it's a little bit funny to think about since this was in 2017. So again, context of 2017, right when Gutenberg development had started. Today, every plugin that extends WordPress does it in a different way. Gutenberg's blocks provide a single, easy to learn entry point that is for an incredible variety of extensions. So I think the easy to learn is kind of, you look back and cringe on it a little bit, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the idea is sound. You have a singular content type. So instead of going out and building a plugin that only works with widgets, or going out and building a plugin that's only for navigation, if you can go out and build a plugin or build a tool that is for blocks, then you're able to target any content type you like. And we'll get to that, why I think that's so incredible in the future. But easy to learn is contentious. You know, I want to touch on it here. This could be a talk in and of itself. But what are the challenges of modern WordPress development? So it's going back to that React and JavaScript. A general understanding of React and JavaScript really is essential. Now, there are tools coming out that kind of sidestep that and allow you to build blocks only using PHP. Great. I mean, it's a great way to speed up development, get blocks out to clients, that sort of thing. But in order to really dive deep into WordPress development, really understand everything that's going on and build future solutions within WordPress, a solid understanding of React and JavaScript will be necessary. And I think this is a kind of funny anecdote. So I built a plugin back in 2015, which was pretty substantial in terms of like the file size, and it used 85% PHP and only 7.4% JavaScript. And then I had a little bit of CSS as well. Fast forward to 2021, my project I'm currently working on is 59% JavaScript, 22% PHP, and then you have SCSS, which might as well be bundled into the JavaScript camp because it is a type of CSS, or it's debatable, but it requires a build process, so you can't just like crack open a SCSS file, make some changes, and then your changes are live. So it adds to the complexity of building projects within WordPress. So because Gutenberg is being continually developed, so I talked about those incremental releases where we had the block editor in 2018, and then 5.8 introduced all this new full site editing stuff, and we'll be getting more in the future. Gutenberg, the plugin itself, is still live and is still churning, and all the latest features of this project for blocks and block editor and full site editing are being developed with Gutenberg. That's always changing, and it can be very hard to keep up with. Now, a lot of fantastic people in the community have come out with things like the Gutenberg Changelog podcast and Gutenberg Times, and there's a fullsiteediting.com, which is fabulous. And even makewordpress.org. There's a lot of resources out there to stay up to date on this, but so much is changing so quickly, it is challenging, especially if you're working, you have a day job, or you're doing other things. It is a challenge to keep up with. And then, you know, documentation has never been WordPress's strong suit. I mean, you could maybe way back when it was, but for the last couple of years, it hasn't been. And I don't think it's necessarily a dig on anybody. I mean, it's an open source community, requires contributions and whatnot, but the documentation is not where it would need to be for someone to step in and learn everything they wanted to know from documentation. And then there's other barriers and hurdles. Because of this increased complexity, it requires, like, I spent a good couple months in my nights and weekends learning JavaScript and React. If you're a professional PHP developer who's building things for WordPress and you have clients and you've got deadlines, do you have time to spend doing that? Not always. So the time and the money add additional hurdles and barriers to entry. So there are challenges with modern WordPress development. I'm going to try to set those aside, and we'll move forward by talking about why all this new stuff can be so cool. So we've gotten through the hurdles of learning JavaScript and getting up to speed with all this stuff, all the changes in Gutenberg and the block editor and everything. So what type of projects might we want to pursue when it comes to blocks? And I kind of broke it down into, three things. You have block plugins. Those could be individual plugins, or those could be block libraries. Individual plugins, maybe a client needs something really specific. Instead of in the past, you may have built like a short code or something. Now you can build a block for them. Block-based themes. This is kind of we're not quite there yet, but by next year we will be. There are a few already. But when I showed you that site editor a few slides ago, you only can use a site editor in a block-based theme. So block-based themes are getting built. There's more and more projects dedicated to building them. And so this is an area that you could direct your development time. And the last one is block-based utility plugins. This is the one I'm going to talk about the most, so I'll kind of skip that for now. But let's just do a quick overview. So block library plugins. If you go to WordPress.org, type in blocks into the plugin repository, a whole bunch will show up. And a lot of them are libraries of blocks. So you install it and you get an accordion block and all sorts of different blocks. And a lot of them are geared towards different themes. If you're a user of the Genesis framework, there's Genesis blocks, there's Cadence blocks for people who use Cadence themes, so on and so forth. Tons of block libraries, a lot of good ones, and they're getting a lot of usage. Quite a bit of them are. Now let's talk about individual blocks. So of course you could build a block, a proprietary block for a client, but there's also, it's kind of just starting now, is the block repository. So what is the block repository? Or sorry, block directory, my apologies. The block directory is this kind of a subset of the plugin repository where it's only for plugins that distribute a single block. And why is that important? Well, inside the block editor, there is the block inserter. And so here I just typed in QR code into the block inserter. And sure enough, you see that there's this QR code block by RetroFox. And that's being pulled in because it's part of the block directory. And here you can see the plugin inside the block directory. So I imagine over time, it's kind of debatable, but I imagine over time that this will become a larger repository where people building one-off plugins that you can kind of one-click install directly from the block editor. And then we have block themes. So if you were to go into the theme repository on WordPress.org and you typed in block-based themes, you'll get these. There aren't many more. Currently, the review process for block-based themes is quite arduous, but these are really cool. And if you have some time, I encourage you to check them out. TT1 Blocks is the block-based version of 2021. And there's a lot of cool things that people are building. And I only imagine that this is just the beginning. This is the experimental phase of block-based themes. In the future, there'll be thousands. We're kind of at the precipice of block-based themes. All right, so now I'm going to talk about block-based utility plugins. So what is a block-based utility plugin? So we talked about blocks. We talked about how blocks and full site editing and block themes. A utility plugin, at least to me, is something that doesn't add a block itself necessarily, could, but doesn't. The main purpose is not to add a block itself, but it interacts with blocks and it interacts with the block editor and the site editor. So Yoast is a great one. So yes, Yoast does have a few blocks, but Yoast is heavily integrated inside the block editor. If you are using the block editor and you have Yoast installed, all that Yoast functionality will be there. That's because it's heavily embedded within the block editor. Hence, it's kind of a block-based project. Doesn't necessarily seem like it because it existed before blocks, but they needed to adapt in order to work within that framework. Then you have some other ones, like I love this one here. It's a custom blocks constructor called Lazy Blocks. This allows you to build blocks with PHP, but in order for the developer to build this plugin, it had to be heavily built into the block editor, so it would allow other people to build blocks with just PHP. And then selfishly, we're going to talk about this one here, which is my plugin. But again, there's so many different ways that plugin that doesn't necessarily install a block can interact with the block editor in novel ways. So this is not a sales pitch for my plugin. I just think that I hope you'll find that the process that I went through in building this, because it was very much a learning process in the beginning. I was learning JavaScript. It was kind of a test bed for me to apply what I learned. It might inspire you to build things yourself, or inspire you to install the classic editor and never deal with blocks again. So developing blocks. So let's talk about the concept. So when I was in the hospitality industry and I worked for a resort, we would have events throughout the year, say Christmas or Easter or something. And I would need to present information about those holidays to market on the website. Now, in WordPress or any website, you can just add that content. And then when the event's over, you just take it down. But what if you could just hide it? Because you know next year or for the next event, you're going to need to add that similar content back. What if you could just hide it and then come back when you needed to, make some changes, and then make it live again? So let's take a look at this concept again. We're on this outdoor adventure demo page. And I want to add a promotional banner right where this arrow is. It might look like something like this. So your ultimate hike adventure awaits. And it's offering you a promotion code and a discount. So great, I created my banner. Okay, well, when this promotion's over, without a plugin, core WordPress, you'd have to delete this, re-update the page, homepage, and then it would be gone. But what if you didn't need to do that? What if you could just hide it? So then when the fall promotion comes out, you could just come in here, maybe tweak the image, tweak the promotion code, and make it visible again. It would really increase workflow. And this is a very simple example. There are much more complicated examples where this is even more useful. So let's think about the requirements here. So we want to conditionally hide a piece of content on a published page without deleting it. We want a single solution that would work with any type of content. So that was a banner, but what if I had a video? What if I had a paragraph, anything? It needs to work with anything. It needs to work with any block, right? Because we talked about all this different content types becoming blocks. This needs to work with any block. And then the solution has to operate within the block editor. I don't want to go to a separate screen in WordPress to do all this, to create my content. No separate interfaces. And then it must be user-friendly and it must be performant. So those are kind of my criteria in starting this. So the first thing I thought of when tackling this problem, a CSS class, right? All you need to do, add this CSS style to your style sheet. And then in the block editor, you can come in here and click on your block, and under additional CSS classes, add hidden, right? We solved our problem. It's hidden, it's within the site editor, and you know, it sort of works, but is it user-friendly? I would say no. Your client, let's say you built this for a client, they'd have to come in here, oh, you add this CSS class to hide stuff. It's also not performant. So if you had this big image and you just hit it, yeah, the public wouldn't see that banner anymore, but that content would still be loaded to the web page, which may make your site slower, especially if you're doing this a lot. So not a good solution. Next option, shortcodes. I had built many of these plugins in the past. You build a shortcode. This is a simple example of a shortcode that has an attribute called hidden. And if the hidden attribute is set to true, hide the content. Very simple. And we can even do this within the block editor. So here we are. I have a shortcode block, hidden, set to true, and wrapping my content. Now, again, it works, right? It's hiding the content. It's within the block editor. But is this user-friendly? I don't think so. I mean, it wasn't user-friendly in the classic editor. I remember having websites with clients where, you know, your shortcodes are just everywhere, wrapping stuff. Also, that's not the point of the block editor, right? It's supposed to be user-friendly. It's supposed to be more what you see is what you get. And so not an option, but definitely something that was heavily employed in the classic editor and in different areas of WordPress. The next one is a custom post type. Now, this is one thing that I've used a lot. I'm sure a lot of you are using a lot. So if you had a type of content like a promotion, maybe you have a custom post type for promotion. Now you can do really complicated, sophisticated development things there. You can, within that custom post type, you can do scheduling, you can do custom fields, all sorts of stuff, and then really sophisticated stuff. And then when it comes to taking that content and displaying it, you'd write a shortcode. And it would look something like this. So I would have my promotions custom post type in a separate part of WordPress. They would give me a little code. I paste it in, and voila, it would be there. Now, this is being used everywhere, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad approach. You know, I'm using a plugin called Easy Digital Downloads to manage, or something, even something similar like WooCommerce, right? If their cart feature for your checkout Generally, it's going to be a shortcode that you're going to paste on your cart page. And then on the front end, it will display the cart. Of course, displaying that as a block is challenging, which is why people quite haven't gotten there. And that's why this type of functionality is very common in WordPress. But that's not what I want, right? It does the first two things, but it's on a separate interface. It's a separate part of WordPress. It's not within the block editor. And I would argue that this is not the most user-friendly. It is performant, but it's not the most user-friendly because they got the client or whoever you're providing this tool to, they need to know what the shortcode is. They need to copy and paste it. They need to use a shortcode block. Not the best. All right, next option. We're getting closer. Let's build a custom block. Now, I'm not going to go into how to do that. I mean, there's lots of ways to do that, and that's a whole nother talk, but let's build a custom block. And let's call it a visibility group. And here what we've done is in our visibility group, we have some visibility controls, much like any other block in the block editor. When you click on the settings sidebar, you see a bunch of controls. Now, this visibility group is like any group in the block editor. It's wrapping around all of our inner blocks. So we have our cover block, heading, paragraph, buttons, right? Now, when we check hide block, it will hide the visibility group, which will in turn hide everything inside of it. And that's great. I mean, you could argue that this is a very valuable solution. We're within the block editor. We have a nice user interface for people. It's performant, and it's everything that we want. The bit of a problem, though, is that it's a group block. You're wrapping blocks. So in some cases, it might work great. But again, we go back to that thought, or the approach for modern WordPress where everything is a block. So if you're trying to take this approach to, let's say, a navigation block, a link block within a navigation bar, it'd be a little annoying to wrap it in a group block like this. The final step of this is add visibility settings to all blocks, right? We don't need a group. We don't need anything to wrap it in. We just want to apply visibility settings to all blocks. And by all blocks, we mean all blocks, right? And so now I'm on the cover block here, and we have our visibility panel, much like we did with the visibility group, and we have this option to hide it. Again, this cover block is just the cover block. It's naturally including all the things that are inside of it. There's no extra block that is needed for this functionality. So we met all four requirements. Now, when I say all blocks, in WordPress now, that means everything. And just look at some of these options. We got post comment form, we got navigation, footers, headers, social icons, audio. I mean, it is truly everything. I mean, we're not quite there yet. There's a lot more development needed in WordPress. There's a lot more, advancements that are needed with full site editing. But this is the vision. If you fast forward in 3 years, I'm using that arbitrarily, but just pretend we're in 3 years, blocks are going to be old hat, and they're going to be everywhere. And so if you can provide functionality to the singular unit, the singular component for adding content, which is a block, you have this amazing amount of power across the entire WordPress ecosystem. So, and then that means, sorry, I forgot this line. That means third-party blocks too. So anybody that builds a block, whether it's a proprietary block for a client, or it's WooCommerce or advanced custom fields, or whoever it is, that will work as well, because if they're following the spec of building a block the way WordPress requires, all this stuff will just work. So the key to all of this, especially with block visibility, is something called block attributes. So I just want to touch on that real quick. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's worth a read. It's basically, it's the data stored by a block. So a block can contain any number of attributes, and it's the background color, it's the button title, it's all the different fields for a block, and it's stored inside of WordPress. So here we are back on our block editor for that page, and we have dimensions. We're on the cover block, and we have dimensions, and we have the visibility panel. Both of these are attributes. So if we switch on over to the code editor, you can see here that you can, in this top line for the cover block, we have over here, we have dimensions, that min height here of 360. And then we can see I highlighted it here, the custom attribute for block visibility, hide block equal to true. And that's represented in the sidebar panel here. So these block attributes are kind of the key to controlling all the functionality of a block. And the key here is that the spec for attributes is uniform across all blocks. So as long as you're adding attributes in the correct way, you can target any block inside of WordPress. So now we get to extending blocks, right? WordPress exposes, and this is going to get a little bit developy, but hopefully you can follow along, and I'm going to try to make it as straightforward as possible. So WordPress exposes a bunch of APIs that allow you to modify existing blocks. If people are familiar with PHP filters, it's virtually the same. It's in React or JavaScript, but it's basically the same thing. And we're going to talk about two of them. The first one is called blocks, register block type. You can kind of ignore the funny notation here, but basically this is the filter that's going to allow us to add custom attributes to any block. Then we have editor.block edit. This is going to allow us to add the custom user interface for controlling those attributes. That little toggle that we saw to hide a block, that's what's going to allow us to add that. And then we're back into PHP now, and we have the render block filter. This is a genius filter. Every block in WordPress runs through this filter. And so you can basically, I'm going to say hijack, but I don't mean to in a negative way. You can modify how any block is rendered by hooking into this filter, this render block filter. And we're going to use all three of these to do conditional visibility. And the last piece that's so awesome is WordPress components. So if I was to, in the past, go out and I want to build a toggle button, right? I need to design that and build that myself or find some external library to build that. WordPress components are an attempt to standardize common components, so you don't have to even worry about building it yourself. You just add the toggle button component, voila, you have a toggle button. We'll talk about that in a second. So let's start with the first step, and that is adding our custom attributes to any WordPress block. And again, we're going to be using the blocks register block type filter. I've simplified this a lot based out of my core code, but let's walk through slowly about what this is doing. So we've added our filter. The filter's here. We have a name and we have a callback function. And at the top here, there's a parameter called settings. And this settings has everything you'd want to know about the block. The name of it, the attributes that are currently assigned to it, all sorts of stuff. And in this first line, I am using that name to identify the freeform block. The freeform block is basically a container for classic editor, for the classic editor. We don't want to be using attributes in the classic editor. So we're going to remove that piece. But then down here, we have our custom attribute for block visibility. So this is the name of it. It's an object. It has the property hide block, and the type is Boolean, true or false. So this is kind of an abstracted view of what we saw in the code editor, where it just said block visibility, and then it said hide equals true. So this looks complicated, but all this is doing is it's adding this custom attribute. And here we're appending this block visibility to all the other existing attributes that the block might have. So this function will run for every block in WordPress, except core-freeform. So if you wanted to modify the paragraph block, you could just do the paragraph block. But this filter gives you full access to every block, which is fantastic. The next thing we need to worry about is block edit. So at this point, we've added our attribute to every block, aside from the freeform block. Now we need to add the UI in order to do that little toggle switch and the panel so that you can actually control that attribute within each block. Here, we're going to use the block edit. Again, we have a filter, have a name, we have a callback function. This callback function is kind of complicated, so I'm not going to go through it all, but basically what we're doing here is we are editing all of the stuff around the block editor, the settings sidebar, you could do toolbars, all that kind of stuff. You're basically editing the edit function for the block. And so what I've done here is I've added my own component called visibility inspector controls. And I know we're getting a little bit deep here, but what the visibility inspector controls component does is it includes the inspector controls component. This is a component that's part of WordPress, and it is, I'm going to mention this here, tune me out if you don't want to hear this. Inspector controls is actually a slot, and it uses slot fill technology, and it allows you basically to inject content within this settings sidebar. Slot fill is fascinating. I actually wrote an article about it on my website, but if you just Google slot fill WordPress, you'll find a lot of interesting articles. It is the method in which you can add content really throughout the block editor. If you're familiar with like actions in PHP, slot fill is kind of how it's being done currently in the block editor. It's truly fascinating. But that's what we're doing here. Just, you can ignore that last couple sentences and just recognize that we are injecting or inserting our panel body with the title visibility and the class name block visibility into the settings sidebar. And you can kind of tie two and two together, right? We have visibility here, scroll down or look down, and we have this hide block set component, and that's going to relate to this piece here. And this hide block component is another component that I have, that I wrote. And when we before we look at that, I talked earlier about components and about how great they were. I really encourage you, if you haven't already, to go check out WordPress-components on WordPress.org and just spend some time reading through it. Again, documentation is not 100%, but it's very useful in terms of getting an understanding of how all this stuff can work. A component is a collection of different functionality that you can just bring right into your project without having to create it yourself. So this is a good example. Button, if you want to create a button. When you pull in the button component from WordPress, it will give you a button already styled to look like the rest of WordPress. You don't even have to worry about anything. You just pull in a button, add a link or whatever you want to do, and you're done. You don't have to worry about styling anything. So it's awesome. So going back here, when we look at the hide block component, you'll notice that there's the toggle control. I think I alluded to this earlier. So I'm pulling in the toggle control, and now I have this nice little toggle that I didn't have to do anything for. I ignore the on change here, the setting of the attribute, but it gives you a little help field, it gives you a title. This color, the color of the toggle is going to match your admin interface, no matter what the person changes for admin. And so using, this idea of these components is just revolutionizing how you build for block editor and WordPress. So now we have our toggle control. At this point, we have created an attribute. We've created the UI for that attribute. We've enabled the attribute on our cover block. And that information is stored on that block in our system. Now, when that block is rendered on the front end, we need to take that attribute into account and conditionally render the block. And we can do that by just using the render block function or filter. So here we have the render block filter. Here's our callback function. All we're doing is it's going to pull in the block content in the block. We're going to look at the block, look at its attributes. Does it have the block visibility attribute? If not, ignore everything. If it does, take a look at the attributes. Is the hide block attribute set to true? If it is set to true, or that's what that's saying there. I'm sorry, reverse of that. I think I have a problem in my code. Anyway, but the point is that if hide block is set to true, you're going to hide, return null, hide the content. If it is set to false, then you are going to return the block content. So as simple as that, we took our attribute, we looked at its value, and then we did a simple conditional. Should we show it? Should we not? That's it. That's it. We're done. So just a quick recap. We registered a custom block attribute. We created UI for configuring block attributes. We rendered the block based on those attributes. And we did this all within the block editor, all within the standard UI for the block editor. And that's it. So all we did in this example is we hid a block. But with this power, these three filters, we were given complete control over any block in WordPress. We can do some amazing things. What about configuring a block based on time, scheduling a block? What about restricting block visibility based on the role of a user? What about even getting more fancy and doing things about like post taxonomy? So is the page that we're on a category, and does the category an integration? You know, all of this stuff. And so, oh, I'm going a little bit long here, but my point is that with these tools, now that every piece of content is now a block, including soon to be navigation and widgets and everything, with these few filters, these few functions, you now have access to controlling all of it. So with this little plugin where that we wanted to hide something, in the past, you'd have to create a one for widgets, hide some widgets, create one for navigation, hide some navigation, create something for the block, for the classic editor, or maybe short codes that would hide stuff. This is a single solution that with just that, we can now hide anything inside of WordPress. And I just find that's fascinating. And so while this was for conditional visibility, you can kind of imagine all the different other things that you could possibly build with this power. Now, I want to end on the fact that WordPress, the block editor, and full site editing has a very long way to go to be as stable and solid, going back to Beth and building sites for clients. I am not somebody who builds sites for clients. I just am building products, right? So there's a lot of functionality after all the years that people built on top of WordPress that likely are not in or capable or built for yet the block editor and full site editing. But it will be. And I think that the tools and the functionality, the capabilities of blocks and all the APIs and everything are only going to get better. And I just wholeheartedly feel strongly that in 2-3 years, building a block is going to be old hat. It's going to be the equivalent of building a short code today. And I just think it's an awesome time, if you aren't already, to start exploring the block editor and exploring building for full site editing, even to start learning JavaScript, even to start learning some of this stuff. They're kind of all over the place, but there are a lot of great resources out there. And I'm always on Twitter, able to answer any questions. I'm still learning as well. But I just wanted to share my little bit of my story in terms of building this product, and just say that if I can do it, anybody can do it. And I do think we're in for some exciting times in WordPress. So thank you for your time. We can either stop there. I can do a quick demo to show this live, but I know we're already at 8:20, so whatever works for everybody.
Well, Nick, I know there's a couple questions here.
Sure.
Before we jump into that, let me see my timestamps here. Glenn, now, of course, this was back at a little bit, but Glenn was asking, how does this affect sites that are developed for mobile devices at all? And that kind of sparked a little bit of the conversation about, I think, mobile first and all that, and how it works with hiding.
Yeah. So specifically for the plugin itself, when something is hidden, it is not rendered. So if it is hidden, it does not exist on the page. There are controls within the plugin. Again, I don't want this to be a sales pitch, but there are controls within the plugin that allow you to do conditional visibility based on the device you're on. And that's why you can keep building this out. But I think it's important to talk about mobile responsiveness in the broader perspective of the block editor. It is not there yet. There are no real good responsive controls within the block editor yet. There's a lot of people who built plugins that add that functionality, but it is not there. And I do know that it is top of mind for the project leads for Gutenberg. But I do expect like in the next year or so, we're going to start to get some of that functionality, but it just simply isn't there yet. Part of the, back to the thing about this is a process, and there's still a long way to go with getting the block editor 100%.
All right, thank you. Also, and this is another question. This is a question from Angel, and it caused a whole flutter in the chat. But he said, "Any thoughts on the new theme.json file?"
Well, I have lots of thoughts.
Careful, we're approaching our
I
window
know,
already.
exactly. So I mean, it is so far from complete. It's hard to have an honest conversation about it. I mean, it's an experiment at the point. To me, it's an experiment at this point. I mean, there are so many things that aren't included yet, and for good reason. But if you were starting today with no prior knowledge of that, and you jumped into the theme.json file, you'd be like, wait, why can't I do this? Why can't I do this? I can do this for this block, but I can't do it for this block. It becomes very confusing very quickly. I think it's a very interesting, if you go into it with the idea that this is we're very new, kind of an experiment, proceed with caution, it's cool, it's great. And I think that, again, a couple of years from now, it's going to be awesome, fantastic. But right now, it's you got to slog through a lot to get it working.
All right. And then Cami asked, can you change the visibility based on device? And there's a little bit of discussion about yes in some different ways, but you know, I'd like to hear it from you.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the ways that, you know, on websites, some responsive design stuff is based on like media queries. So like as the screen gets smaller based on a media query, something will become hidden. So there is functionality there. Again, that's just a CSS class. If you want to do screen size visibility, there is, again, I hesitate to mention this, but in the premium version of the plugin, there is device control. So you can actually detect if you're on a PC or if you're using Chrome or you're on Internet Explorer or you're using a mobile device, it will actually detect the device, and then you can actually conditionally render content that way. So both ways.
All right. Another question, Leonard, I think. He says, simple question. How can I copy blocks from one page to another? And also says you wanted to say that you had a nice bookshelf in your background.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I can show you how to copy blocks from one page to another. The best thing to do is like, you can just select them and just on your keyboard, at least last time I tried it, you could just Command C, and then just paste them right in. There's a couple of different ways. You can also go to the code editor. I hate to recommend that, and just copy the code and paste it in. If we have time for a demo, I can definitely show that if we get to that point, but there are many.
All right. Oh, and let's see, let's see. All right, a couple questions left. Steve says, what is the best crash course tutorial on the JS, React, etc., requiring for building blocks?
Ooh, that's a good one. So I don't know off the top of my head. Like last summer, it was like Code Academy or something. There was one of those online things that has like, you know, dummies guided JavaScript, right? And you kind of walk through it and you kind of learn the basics. Once I got through that and I understood like what a variable was, and like you have to learn, one of the important things for working with Gutenberg and stuff, you should have an understanding of JSX, which is I don't know the technical term, but it's basically a format of JavaScript. And once you kind of know the basics there, I kind of abandoned all standard coursework, right? I just dove into Gutenberg. And so WordPress is getting better about in the documentation, showing you how to build a simple block. There's even some tools called Create Block that is maintained by the WordPress team that allows you to get up and running, building a block kind of from scratch. Because in order to build a block, you need to set up a development environment in JavaScript with JavaScript and all that kind of stuff. So it is a bit complicated, but instead of like going to like a book or going to like a course about JavaScript and React. Do that just to get the basics and then turn back to WordPress and focus on the tools that they have. I just felt it was much easier for myself, at least, to learn while doing, as opposed to just learning from a book or learning from a course that had nothing to do with WordPress and was just teaching me all sorts of stuff about JavaScript and React. That was just my own process.
All right. And Rich Tabor has a question. He says, how do you think devs like you can do a better job of informing the global audience of how Gutenberg is coming along?
That's a great question. So I personally feel very passionate about this stuff. And I think that I know that I'm personally going to be doing a better job about just taking what I've learned in this process and just writing more blog posts, putting this stuff out on Twitter more, being more vocal within the community. Because I'll admit, I've been doing this, playing with WordPress since 2012. I have like a single contribution to core, right? I have a couple plugins that I've built. I'll speak for myself. I have the opportunity and the time and the ability to be contributing more. I think that it's hard because people have jobs and people have clients they need to take care of and all this other stuff. But I know that I personally going to be trying to do a better job about contributing to core, like fixing documentation that I find that's wrong, promoting the positive things that are happening with Gutenberg. I mean, there's so much negativity. I tried to stay a bit clear of it, but it's a big change to the WordPress ecosystem. It's a lot of agencies, a lot of people that are heavily invested with huge clients that this is a challenging time. And we need to respect that. But I want to showcase like some of the cool stuff that you can do with WordPress, because that's how we get through this time, by showing that there are some things you can do that are easy and awesome and things you could never do before, but you now can with Gutenberg.
Right on. All right. Well, on behalf of all the different WordPress meetups that have kind of come together for this mega meetup, we want to thank you and Beth for spending your evening with us. And